The most obedient slaves are held by fear, not by chains. Franz Kafka. Before we begin, here's a small ritual. Write in the comments one word that accurately describes your current state. Sign it and let's get started. There is something in the atmosphere that no one talks about. It is not mentioned in the news, not written in reports, not addressed in public discussions. But it seeps into everything. It hangs in offices. It lingers in messages. It floats silently through crowded streets and quiet rooms. It is not an event or a moment. It is the ongoing background of modern life. Fear. Not the kind that makes people scream or run, but the kind that shapes decisions, habits, identities. A low, constant pressure that pushes from within. People do not name it because it has been present for too long. When something becomes permanent, it no longer feels like a threat. It feels like reality. This fear has no defined source. It does not begin with a gun or a scream or a disaster. It begins with an email, with a raised eyebrow, with an update to the policy. It begins when someone hesitates before speaking or chooses to remain silent. It spreads when people stop asking why and start learning how to stay unnoticed. It settles into minds not as panic, but as strategy. People don't feel terror. They feel tired. They don't scream. They comply. They don't resist. They adapt. And in this adaptation, fear finds its perfect form. There is no visible enemy, no dictator, no army, no curfew. The machine has learned to evolve. It no longer needs bars or chains. It operates through expectations, social codes, quiet consequences. Its genius lies in subtlety. It does not strike. It nudges. It does not prohibit. It suggests. It does not command. It advises. The result is more effective than violence. It builds obedience without rebellion, conformity without force, participation without enthusiasm. Everyone plays along because not playing feels dangerous, even if no one says why. From childhood, the message is clear. Be good. Follow rules. Don't make trouble. Don't ask too much. It is framed as politeness, discipline, emotional intelligence. But beneath it lies a deeper program. Stay inside the lines. Keep the system running. Don't be the reason something changes. Those who do change things, after all, are often the first to disappear. Not physically, but socially. Excluded, isolated, redefined. And so, gradually, people learn the cost of deviation, not through threats, through examples. What makes this structure so powerful is its invisibility. There are no speeches, no slogans, only the quiet logic of self-preservation. People begin to limit themselves long before anyone asks them to. They pre-edit their thoughts, their language, their dreams. They lower their eyes, lower their voices, lower their expectations, and they call it maturity, responsibility, realism. But in truth, it is exhaustion. It is caution turned permanent. It is fear normalized. Modern control doesn't want resistance. It wants fatigue. It wants people too busy, too uncertain, too anxious to think clearly. The more anxious you are, the more predictable you become. The more tired you are, the easier you are to manage. And so fear becomes efficiency. It becomes structure. It becomes the energy that fuels daily behavior. Without it, the gears might stop. But with it, they hum. Smoothly, silently, relentlessly. Fear has been refined. It no longer needs to be loud. Its strength lies in how ordinary it feels. It is the reason people check their tone before posting. It is why they avoid certain topics. It is why they smile when they don't want to, agree when they don't mean it, nod when they should speak. It is why they stay when they want to leave. And in doing all of this, they reinforce the machine, not because they believe in it, but because they fear what would happen if they didn't. No one needs to be punished anymore. Control no longer arrives with threats. It does not demand submission through pain or declare its dominance with a raised voice. It has become softer, more intelligent. The modern system does not act like an oppressor. It behaves like a caretaker. It does not imprison bodies. It shapes behavior. And what shapes behavior most effectively is not force, but fear. The kind of fear that never needs to show its face. The kind that operates in silence, hidden inside choices that seem voluntary but are already pre-written. People believe they are acting freely, making decisions based on personal logic and preferences, but underneath lies an architecture that has already narrowed the path. Before any decision is made, the framework of consequences is already in place. The invisible fences are drawn. This is not punishment. Punishment requires confrontation. Control instead prefers invisibility. It makes you want what is allowed and fear what is not even forbidden, only unspoken. It manufactures boundaries that feel natural. It teaches people not just to obey rules, but to feel uncomfortable around the idea of breaking them. Obedience becomes second nature, not out of loyalty, not out of trust, but from a subtle anticipation of judgment, fear of being different, fear of losing position, fear of misunderstanding. Not loud, not dramatic, but efficient. In Kafka's worlds, people were trapped not by bars but by processes. Endless, absurd processes with no exit, no clarity, no answers. The true terror was not in violence but in confusion, in being lost in a maze where nothing is explained, but everything is demanded. That is what modern control looks like. There are no trials, only procedures. No verdicts, only delays. No guards, only forms. And the forms become the reality. A person is declared guilty not by a judge, but by a delay in reply, by an automated message, by a silent update. And they accept it. They internalize it. Because resistance is not even clearly possible. Against what? Against whom? This control does not seek to break you. It seeks to shape you into predictability. You are not an enemy. You are a unit, a function, something to be measured and adjusted. You are a profile, a pattern of data, a user. Your preferences are tracked, your responses recorded, your movements anticipated. You are not forced into anything. You are guided, nudged, streamlined, for your own comfort, for your own efficiency. And in the name of this comfort, your ability to resist quietly dissolves. Not because someone has taken it from you, but because you stopped remembering what it looked like. There is no violence, only consequence. You post something and lose reach. You say something and lose opportunities. You don't agree and you are quietly moved to the margin. No one tells you why. No one needs to. The system is self-cleaning. It filters out disturbance with algorithms, with trends, with silence. And the fear it instills is not of physical harm, but of irrelevance, of invisibility, of disconnection. Control has been refined. It now travels through networks, through gestures, through atmosphere. It has replaced threat with suggestion. It has replaced command with expectation. And what's more dangerous, it has made people do it to themselves. There is no longer a need for guards or supervisors. Every person has absorbed their own monitor. The line is already drawn in the mind. The voice of doubt, the voice of hesitation, the careful glance. That is the new law. No one tells you what to do. You already know. You feel it before you speak. You adjust before you act. You rewrite before you publish. And you smile. Because everyone else is doing the same. Because to question it would be strange. And being strange is dangerous. Not deadly, just isolating. Just enough to make people choose silence. Over and over. This is not punishment. This is design. A system where everything flows smoothly because everyone is already controlled, not by a hand, not by a face, but by the structure itself. And in this structure, fear does not scream. It whispers. It hums. It becomes the rhythm of life. Quiet, constant, absolute. Fear has never been a malfunction of the system. It has always been part of the architecture, not a side effect, not a mistake, but the core mechanism. The system doesn't merely tolerate fear, it cultivates it. Because fear is useful, predictable, reproducible, and above all, powerful. A person in fear does not ask questions. A person in fear does not organize, does not rebel, does not pause to reflect. They move, they react, they produce, they obey. And this obedience is not the result of belief or conviction. It is survival. The brilliance of fear is that it doesn't have to convince you of anything. It doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It only needs to remind you of what can be lost. Reputation, security, belonging, a job, a future. These threats are never stated openly. They do not need to be. Fear knows how to operate in silence, and this silence is louder than any speech. It builds routines, habits, entire personalities. The fearful person becomes a model citizen, not because they trust the structure, but because they fear losing their place within it. The system learned long ago that direct oppression is clumsy, inefficient. It breeds resistance. But fear, slow, persistent fear, does not need to show itself. It only needs to shape the context. It doesn't tell people what to do. It makes them feel what's safest, what's expected, what will not lead to isolation. That's why fear is not a breakdown. It's a resource, a renewable one. Because the more people are afraid, the more energy they generate. Emotional energy, mental energy, social energy. And this energy is extracted without notice, without complaint. The system doesn't harvest crops or metals. It harvests human attention, human effort, human worry. It thrives on emotional investment. It needs you to care, not deeply, just enough. Enough to stay engaged, enough to never stop moving, enough to chase stability without ever reaching it. Fear is the engine that keeps this movement going. You work not for growth, but to avoid collapse. You comply not for reward, but to avoid disappearance. You participate not to be seen, but to avoid being forgotten. And so, fear becomes institutionalized, structured into every layer. In education, it appears as the fear of failure. In workplaces, the fear of being replaced. In society, the fear of judgment, exclusion, disapproval. These fears are small, but cumulative. They do not explode. They accumulate, one upon another, like sediment, until the whole personality is formed around avoidance, around survival. And that survival is the ideal condition for the system to thrive. You start to identify with your fear. You call it responsibility, maturity, realism. You believe you're just being careful, when in fact, you are exhausted from calculating every step. You stop dreaming, not because you have no imagination, but because dreams feel dangerous. You stay in place, not because it's comfortable, but because movement feels like exposure. Fear has reshaped your boundaries. You no longer need walls. You carry them within you. And this internalization is the goal. When fear no longer needs an external source, when it becomes part of the inner voice, the system has succeeded. You are no longer controlled. You are self-regulating. You are your own handler. You keep yourself in check. You enforce your own limits. You discourage your own rebellion, not out of reason, not out of clarity, but because the system has convinced you that safety is everything and that risk is death. But the risk is already here. It's in the slow erasure of self, in the quiet resignation, in the way your days pass without resistance, without weight, without memory. Fear keeps you moving, yes, but in circles. It keeps you productive, yes, but without direction. You are not building a life. You are maintaining a condition, and that condition is acceptable, manageable, predictable, which means it's ideal for the system, for the structure, for control. Fear is not a flaw in the design. It is the battery, and it will keep powering this mechanism as long as you stay inside it. The most efficient form of control is not the one that openly commands, but the one that remains unreadable, unclear, constantly present yet always out of reach. This is the genius of Kafka's vision. He understood that power does not need to show itself in order to dominate. It only needs to shape the environment in such a way that the subject becomes lost within it, a man trapped not by bars, but by procedures, not by rules, but by their absence, or worse, by the illusion that the rules exist even if no one can name them. This is not discipline, it is disorientation. In Kafka's The Trial, the protagonist is arrested without explanation. He is told he has been accused, but not what for. The process unfolds, but never resolves. The machinery moves, but without destination. This is not an allegory. It is the shape of reality under systems that rely on fear, not logic. Systems that do not need to justify themselves because they are never truly seen. They exist in forms, in offices, in repetitions. The person who resists is not crushed by brute force. They are worn down by absurdity. The absence of answers is not a failure, it is the method. The confusion is not a side effect, it is the structure. And within that confusion, fear grows. The kind of fear that is hard to name because it has no object. The fear of the undefined, of delay, of process, of silence. People comply not because they are forced to, but because they cannot locate the point of resistance. There is no door to knock on, no face to confront, only corridors, only forms, only polite responses that lead nowhere. This is the transformation of law into fear, not because the law punishes harshly, but because it becomes unreadable, a presence that is both total and vague. It watches but never speaks. It waits but never answers. It requires obedience without clarity. And this kind of fear is more exhausting than terror, because it never ends, because it never escalates. It simply persists, wearing down the body through tension, eating through time like rust. This atmosphere spreads. It is not limited to courts or offices. It becomes the tone of life itself. Rules exist, but they shift. Expectations are high, but unspoken. Mistakes are punished, but the definition of a mistake is always changing. A word, a gesture, a hesitation, anything can become a signal of disloyalty, of deviance, of danger. And so people begin to erase themselves, not completely, just enough. They round off their edges, remove their texture, avoid extremes, aim for neutrality. But neutrality is not safe. It is simply another layer of control. The idea that you can remain untouched by disappearing into the background is itself a product of fear. It is the illusion of safety bought by self-erasure. People learn to perform compliance, to mimic agreement, not because they are convinced, but because the cost of misalignment is too unclear to challenge. You don't need a cage when people are terrified of stepping outside a line they cannot even see. Kafka described this world without needing to name the time or place. Because it is not tied to an era, it is a structure of experience. It is what happens when power becomes abstract, not absent, but formless. The castle in the castle is unreachable, not because it's protected, but because its logic is unknowable. It exists, but only as rumor, as procedure, as paperwork. The closer one gets to it, the more it dissolves into process. And that process is the true prison. In such a system, the individual becomes smaller, not crushed, but diminished. Their presence is not denied, it is overlooked. They are not eliminated, they are ignored. Not because they lack value, but because their value is unmeasurable by a structure that does not care to see. The law, once meant to offer stability, becomes an echo chamber, and inside that echo, people learn to speak only what is safe, only what will not return to them as suspicion. This is how fear works in its most sophisticated form. It does not intimidate, it confuses. It replaces certainty with endless waiting. It replaces dialogue with forms. It replaces justice with protocol. And in doing so, It does not silence people violently. It makes them silent by choice. Silence becomes the only rational response to a system that no longer responds. The law no longer protects. It observes. It floats above, distant and unanswerable. And people adjust. They lower their gaze. They speak in pre-approved tones. They erase the sharpness from their questions. They comply not because they believe, but because they are tired. Tired of the unknown. Tired of the risk. Tired of the absence of clarity. And fear, silent and shapeless, grows stronger through this exhaustion. It feeds not on panic, but on weariness, on the steady drip of compliance that flows from people who no longer know what they are afraid of, only that they must remain afraid. The system does not draw its energy from steel or wires, from industry or labor alone. It feeds on something far more renewable, far more abundant: human tension. Every flicker of anxiety, every twitch of doubt, every internal tightening of the gut is fuel. The more agitated the mind, the more restless the body, the faster the machinery spins. A person in a constant state of low-level panic becomes perfectly functional, not dangerous, not disruptive, but productive. The system has no need for peace. It requires friction, constant managed internal friction. This anxiety is not explosive. It doesn't cause revolutions. It causes movement, ceaseless movement. People rushing to stay afloat, to not fall behind, to not make a mistake, worrying about appearances, performance, relevance. The pace never slows. The standard is never clear, and that is the point. As long as people are running, they will not look up. As long as their minds are full, they will not question the emptiness of the path. The anxiety is orchestrated to keep the loop intact. Wake, work, perform, scroll, consume, sleep, repeat. The wheel turns because the hearts keep racing. Fear used to be a reaction. Now it's a baseline. It is designed into the environment. Notifications, updates, policies, schedules. Everything built to provoke a low-level alert. Everything optimized for stimulation without satisfaction. The nervous system never rests. The eyes are always processing. The ears always catching distant warnings. Even moments of rest are infected, filled with noise, filled with distractions that do not allow stillness. Because stillness is the enemy. In stillness, thought becomes possible. In stillness, people notice. But no one is still. Stillness is now laziness, idleness, a failure to optimize. And so, people self-monitor. They check, they scroll, they correct, they adapt. Their attention becomes fragmented. Their focus becomes consumable. And this consumption is not accidental. It is harvested. The more fractured the mind, the more easily it is directed. The more unstable the emotions, the more predictable the behaviors. The system doesn't need coherence. It needs engagement. And nothing engages more than anxiety. What once required guards and supervisors is now maintained by rhythm. The rhythm of endless anticipation. A message that might come, a change that might happen, a crisis that might arrive. The body is always preparing for what never fully comes. The tension builds, but has no outlet, no conclusion, just renewal. You go to bed with it, you wake up with it, and it whispers, stay alert, stay prepared, stay compliant. The message is never loud, but it is everywhere. This anxiety becomes the default emotional state. It shapes posture, breath, thought. People learn to speak quickly, to apologize reflexively, to justify themselves before being questioned. They anticipate disappointment. They prepare explanations. They tighten their muscles before entering conversations. This is not caution. It is conditioning. People are not just responding to events. They are operating under permanent internal pressure, and this pressure becomes the system's power source. There are no wires connecting the machine to the human body. There are no levers or chains, but the connection is there. Invisible, neurological, emotional. A current flows from every worried heart into the structure that converts it into control. into metrics, into growth, into momentum. The anxious mind becomes a generator, and the more uncertain the future, the more efficient the output. Hope, after all, is erratic. But fear is steady, fear is reliable. People begin to self-regulate based on this anxiety. They stop sharing what feels dangerous. They adjust their tone. They rehearse their thoughts before expressing them. They scan the environment for signs of approval or danger. They become cautious not only in what they do, but in what they feel. And soon, the system doesn't need to monitor them at all. They are monitoring themselves. Their worry has become policy. Their hesitation, the new law. And this is the brilliance of a fear-fed system. It doesn't need loyalty. It doesn't need belief. It only needs your nerves, your unease, your hunger for reassurance that never arrives. And so, you give more, you perform more, you connect more, even when nothing feels real. Because connection, even shallow, feels safer than silence. Because movement, even frantic, feels safer than stillness. Because exhaustion, even chronic, feels safer than falling behind. You are not failing. You are functioning exactly as intended. The machine is not broken. It is humming smoothly because your anxiety is its battery. And as long as you keep searching, responding, checking, adjusting, proving, it keeps running. And it will keep running until you stop. Until the pulse of fear breaks. Until silence returns, not as defeat, but as refusal. Until stillness becomes rebellion. The most devastating revelation is not that the system controls you, but that the system is you. Not in the abstract, not metaphorically, but structurally, intimately. It is in the way you speak, the way you move, the way you hesitate before acting. It is in every "I should," every "that's just how it is." Every time you suppress a question before it's fully formed. The system does not live in towers or secret rooms. It lives in gestures, in routines, in the tiny compromises repeated over years until they become personality. You are not controlled by an external force. You are inhabited by fragments of a larger mechanism. Each time you silence yourself out of fear of reaction, you activate a part of that machinery. Each time you nod instead of disagree, scroll instead of reflect, avoid instead of ask, you reinforce the blueprint. And this blueprint is not imposed. It is absorbed, passed through generations, education, culture, media. It arrives early, it settles deep, and over time it becomes indistinguishable from your own voice. This is not a metaphor. The system survives because people internalize its rules so completely that no external enforcement is necessary. The most efficient form of power is one that makes you forget it's there. And it does so by dissolving into habit, into language, into feeling. You think you are making your own decisions, but you are operating within a structure that has already narrowed your range of possibility. It whispers in preferences. It filters your desires. It selects what you believe to be spontaneous. You begin to organize yourself in ways that align with this structure. You monitor your tone, adjust your opinions, limit your range. You make choices that feel personal, but are in fact responses to a social script too vast to see. And the more you adjust, the more invisible the structure becomes. Until there is no need for reminders, no punishments, no visible control. Because the control lives in you, in your second thoughts, in your carefulness, in your silence. Each part of you that has been trained to fear is now doing the system's work. Every moment you choose safety over expression, efficiency over depth, image over substance, you serve it. Not because you believe in it, not because you benefit from it, but because it has convinced you that there is no alternative, that anything else would be risk, would be chaos, would be loss. But the loss has already happened, slowly, quietly, in the erosion of inner clarity, in the fading of sharp thoughts, in the surrender of instinct. You are not just afraid, you are fragmented. pulled apart into roles, performances, versions. There is the version of you at work, the version with friends, the version online, the version in silence. None of them lie, but none of them tell the whole truth. And in this fragmentation, the system thrives. Because the more divided you are, the less dangerous. The more inconsistent your voice, the easier to ignore. The terrifying elegance of the system is that it doesn't ask you to betray yourself. It asks you to edit, to trim, to polish, until your rawness disappears, until your edge dulls, until your uniqueness becomes marketable, until what once made you unpredictable becomes manageable. And you consent to this, not because you're weak, but because you've been trained to see it as survival, as being realistic, as growing up. This is how power sustains itself without violence. By making people shape themselves into silence. By convincing them that to be whole is to be exposed. That to be honest is to be unsafe. And so, people live as curated fragments and call it identity. They reduce themselves to stability and call it peace. But there is no peace in suppression, only performance. The system is not someone else's invention. It is the accumulation of all our fears, all our silences, all our compromises. It is not built against us. It is built from us. And that is what makes it so unshakable. We are not trapped by something alien. We are trapped by the habits we now call normal. And unless those habits break, unless those quiet, invisible scripts are interrupted, we remain not just inside the system, we are the system. Functioning, repeating, forgetting. No command is needed, no chain. The most obedient prisoner is the one who wears their cage as skin, the one who polices their own thoughts, who corrects their own instincts, who fears the parts of themselves that don't fit. This is the final stage of control. When you defend what destroys you, when you protect what drains you, when the part of you that still resists begins to feel like the problem, and that part, the one that still aches, still questions, still wants, becomes the only part not fully assimilated. It is inconvenient. It is dangerous. It is alive. And the system, even as it feeds on the rest of you, cannot fully kill it, because it does not understand it, because that part was never designed. It was never trained. It was never broken. It is the part that remembers, the part that knows, the part that will not adapt. Fear is often described as isolating, but in truth, it binds. It connects people, not through trust, but through tension. In fearful environments, individuals mirror each other's silence, adapt to each other's caution, reflect each other's restraint. They become synchronized in hesitation, in avoidance, in the performance of safety. But this unity is hollow. It does not create solidarity. It dissolves it. It turns a crowd into fragments, individuals side by side, but alone, aligned, but disconnected. Fear gathers people only to scatter them within. In such a space, dialogue disappears. It is replaced by noise, safe noise, filtered language, predictable expressions. No one speaks from the center of themselves. They speak from the part that has been shaped by anticipation, by imagined consequences, by the need to remain acceptable. And so society becomes full of voices, but void of meaning. Everyone speaking, no one hearing. Everyone watching, no one seeing. Trust evaporates. Spontaneity dies. What remains is performance, repetition, echoes. And when the echoes become enough, when the rehearsed responses no longer feel rehearsed, the system achieves its final goal: silence. Not absence of sound, but absence of resistance. The internal silence that comes when fear has done its work completely. People no longer need to be reminded to obey. They do it on their own. They teach it to others. They enforce it without orders. The system becomes autonomous, self-replicating, living inside each individual like a quiet engine. The cage now breathes with the prisoner. They are one. This is the perfection of control. not through oppression, but through absorption. And yet, within this stillness, something remains. A tremor, a flicker. The very fear that tamed you still carries power, because fear, by its nature, is energy. And energy can shift. It can be suppressed, but not destroyed. It can be redirected. What once kept you quiet can push you forward. What once made you bend can make you break through. If fear can silence, it can also scream. If it can freeze, it can also ignite. The same pulse that kept you small can be turned into fire. Not the fire of destruction, but of clarity, of movement, of return. Because fear is proof that something in you is still alive, still sensing danger, still refusing to disappear. And if you stop running from it, if you stand inside it, it becomes a doorway. Through that doorway, another self begins to form, a self that remembers what it is to speak without calculation, to move without permission, to live without surveillance. Not recklessly, but freely. A self not shaped by approval, but by truth. And that truth is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It only needs to be real, real enough to resist, real enough to begin again. We're sure you've discovered plenty of value, so subscribe now and stay connected.